Welcome, subscribers. Thank you guys so much for tuning in this week. We are starting a new series all about experimental processing methods, how that affects the tasting notes of your cup, and where the coffee industry is going, as well as how to brew those experimental processing methods. So, this week we are really going to be honing in on microorganisms and yeast that are used within those experimental processing methods and how that affects the end tasting notes of your cup. So we're going to give a broad overview of the microorganisms and yeast that's found within the coffee in those experimental processing methods. We're going to kind of then dive into those different types of processing methods a little bit, and then we're really going to hone in on how that affects the tasting notes of your cup, what it's going to do to the coffee, and then we're going to talk about how to brew for it. So let's get into it. First and foremost, what is a processing method in coffee? Processing methods is when the ripe berries or cherries are picked, hand selected from the coffee tree or shrub, and then they are removed, that coffee cherry is removed from the bean. That is what is called the processing method, is how that cherry is removed from the actual bean inside. There's naturals, there's wash, there's honey process, there's anaerobic, there's carbonic, there's lactic acid fermentations. There's a lot of different processing methods, but specifically we are going to be diving into the yeast and microorganisms. So now that we know what a processing method is within coffee, which is how that cherry is removed from the bean, let's dive into specifically the yeast and microorganisms that are found when that processing method occurs. This week we're going to be talking about when the mucilage, which is a sugary substance that's left around the outside of the bean. So actually when the cherry's removed, that red skin is removed, there's a sticky, sugary substance called mucilage that's left on the outside of it. That protects the bean and also gives it nutrients. Yeast needs a couple things to survive. Yeast needs oxygen, a warm, wet environment, and sugar. That yeast is a living organism. So just like when you put it in bread, that's what makes it rise. It then eats the sugars and things within the bread and makes it rise. Same thing with beer. Beer is the best relation that I can make to coffee in this, because craft beers use a lot of wild yeast. And so there's some wild yeast that is found on the different materials that they use when they brew beer, and that then eats the sugars, and once it eats the sugars, it releases CO2 gases and produces alcohol, and it ferments the beer. So it's the same thing within coffee, but they shorten up that time that it ferments, so it's not going to ferment as long. And then when you roast the coffee, obviously there's no alcohol found within it. But in that, the mucilage is left on the bean. The yeast, which is a living organism, needs sugar, water, oxygen, and it off-gases CO2. So there's some really great photos in the write-up that we sent to you. You can actually see the small little bubbles of when it's off-gassing and getting into those different things. So there are two main ways that this is done. So cherry's been removed, that sticky mucilage is left on the outside of it, and yeast is naturally found within the farm that is left on the cherries and things and just in the air. So there's anaerobic and aerobic. Anaerobic is without oxygen, aerobic is with. So anaerobic is when they put the sticky mucilage and bean into a closed water tank, put a one-way valve at the top of it, and seal off any oxygen that's in there. What happens is that yeast is then going to activate in that warm, wet environment, start going to eat those sugars, and it's going to off-gas CO2. When it off-gasses, it's going to remove all that oxygen and push it up the one-way valve, and then the fermenting process is going to happen. There's going to be a smaller amount of fermenting process that happens because the more and more that it ferments, the less and less oxygen that's found within the tank. But it's much easier to control in this kind of a processing method. The other way is aerobic, which is where there's no top to the tank. This is very common, and it's just going to sit in water, and that fermenting process is just going to happen. Now, this is a much harder processing method to control because you don't have that variable of the more that it off-gasses, the less oxygen that's in there. So those are kind of the two ways. We're not going to dive super deep into them because anaerobic and aerobic processing methods are a processing method all of themselves, but that's just a general overview for you guys. Next, we're going to talk about the factors that affect fermenting. So there is time and temperature. So the warmer that environment is within that tank, the more hospitable that environment is for fermentation, for that yeast in the microorganisms to happen. So higher temperature, faster fermentation. Longer is going to be quicker. Longer, obviously, there's going to be more fermenting that occurs. If it's colder, it's going to take longer. Warmer is going to be quicker. So those are the two variables that really matter, and a lot of producers have to try to control those environments. So they'll try to do it in the shade to kind of keep it out of the sun and keep it cool. And they also will use spring water and different things to kind of control those environments. But time and temperature has an impact. Most processing methods will happen, I've seen any as short as 8 hours, as long as 70 hours. They kind of fall within that range typically. The coffee that we sourced is a double fermented, so he does it for 20 hours and then 28 hours. So he actually stops fermenting, empties water, and then restarts the fermenting process again. So we will dive more into that later. But a quick note that I really want to point out is a lot of these experimental processing methods, you will see what's called carbonic maceration, which for those of you who are wine drinkers or are very into wine, you may have heard of that. That is something from the wine industry. So there's carbonic maceration, which is where the coffee cherry is put within the tank. That's where the entire cherry is going to be ripe, beans picked, cherry left on, put into the tank. That's not what we're talking about this week. What we are talking about this week is anaerobic fermentation. That's where that sticky mucilage is left on the outside of the bean, and that's put into the water. So it's a subtle difference, cherry or mucilage, but it does definitely differentiate between the two processing methods. One is carbonic maceration, one is anaerobic fermentation. Anaerobic fermentation within yeast and natural microorganisms is what we're focusing on this week, okay? So, this is kind of the crux of it all. What does all of that mean? This feels like a science lesson for you guys, so I hope you've stayed with me and I've dumbed it down enough. There's a lot of compounds and organic processes that happen within this, but what does that mean for the end tasting notes of your cup? A experimental processing method within different yeasts is really going to pull out what is already in the coffee cherry and in that mucilage. So you're not necessarily adding something to the coffee that wasn't already there, but what you're going to do is you're going to create an extreme of what's already there. So different yeasts are going to produce different extremes within that coffee. So it could be mouthfeel for one. So if one has a really creamy mouthfeel that's found within that mucilage from that sugar, that yeast that is then added to it and allows to ferment on that sugar is really going to pull out that creamy mouthfeel. Let's say the coffee cherry and mucilage that was around it for a long time while it was growing is really fruit forward, it's really berry, it has a lot of mango notes, it has a lot of apricot notes. That yeast, when it hits it, is really going to pull an extreme and make that an extreme tasting note in your coffee. That's why these processing methods and experimental methods are so popular, because you're not adding something to the coffee that wasn't already there. You're just really accentuating what is already found within the mucilage and the cherry. A very common yeast that is used is Saccharomyces. Saccharomyces is found within a lot of beers that you find, with a lot of sours, and it is one of the most common found within the experimental processing methods. Now, quick note of where I think the coffee industry is headed. Currently, a lot of it is wild yeast or it's added. Saccharomyces or different kinds of yeast are added to it. I think the longer the coffee industry goes with these experimental processing methods, the more that specific yeasts are going to be added to draw out specific tasting notes. So let's say a Saccharomyces is really going to pull out fruit notes within a certain kind of coffee. They're going to add Saccharomyces. Or let's say they really want to accentuate the sweetness that's found within it and have more of a vanilla note. They're going to pull in like a Lachromyces bacillus, which is a different kind of yeast. And that's going to really pull into the sweetness of that coffee. And I think the longer these processing methods go, the more the producers will really be able to dial in what yeast to add, how long to do it, and you're going to get really tasty coffees coming from it. That's where I think the coffee industry personally is headed, and it would not surprise me to see more and more experimental processing methods with specific yeast mentioned in that processing method. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys for what tasting notes are going to be found from different types of yeast. It's hard to cover them all because this is a new processing method. This is something new to the coffee industry. And so there's not a lot of good research to back and say, hey, this type of yeast is going to bring out this tasting note, because it is very specific to origin, to your soil, to how long it's been in the sun, to elevation, and all those things that we cover. But there will be specific things that you can identify, whether it be body, mouthfeel, sugars, or sweetness, or your acidity and fruit notes. So anyways, that is specifically how it's going to affect your tasting notes. Next, I want to talk about how to brew with specific yeast fermentations. This is tough because, like I just mentioned, it's very coffee specific. However, some general rules of thumb is what I would say is go one grind size finer. The reason to go one grind size finer is you're going to give more surface area to your water, which is really going to be able to bring out some of those extremes that this yeast and microorganisms have brought out from the processing method. The next thing I would do is for filter recommendations, I would do one of two things. I would either do a Chemex, which you have here. That Chemex filter is really thick. It's double layered or triple layered even when you put it in on certain sides. And it's really going to draw out some of those oils and allow you to taste what that yeast and microorganisms has produced with that fermentation process in your coffee. The other one that I would recommend is your V60, which I've got right here. It's much thinner, as you can see, only single. And this is really going to allow more of those oils to come into your coffee and experience those extremes. Those would be the two that I'd recommend. You can also double layer your V60s if you want to get a little bit more clarity, but not as much as a Chemex, because it's still going to be finer. So those are kind of what I recommend for filters. You could try a real fine metal filter mesh, but I think you're just going to get too much oils and too much complexity and body with it. You're not going to be able to identify that specific thing. So a quick note on if you're experiencing like winey tasting notes, almost like it has tannins and it almost has like a little funk to it, that's an over fermented coffee. It happens. But it's not an ideal situation or an ideal tasting note to experience in your coffee. With that in mind, what you want to do is cool down your brew temperature a little bit and make sure you use a Chemex filter to pull out some of those oils and enjoy as best you can. The last thing that I do for every cup of coffee I drink, call me weird, is let it cool down. Why I say that is because my palate doesn't have to try to overcome a really hot liquid to then identify tasting notes. When the coffee has cooled to where it's very easily drinkable, it allows me to really taste and pull out those tasting notes found within my coffee. So for these experimental processed coffees, I would really recommend just let it cool off a bit and then try to taste for it, and taste from the time that you first brew it when it's really hot all the way down to when it's colder room temperature. It's what I do every time I drink a cup of coffee. I'm not the kind of person that likes piping hot coffee. I hate burning my taste buds, but that's another note. Anyway, so that's what I would recommend for how to taste coffee, how to brew your coffee, and how to really get the best out of these experimental yeast and microorganisms that's found within the processing methods. I hope this was interesting to you guys. I'm super passionate about this. I think this is where the coffee industry is headed, and it is going to be extremely exciting. We sourced a double fermented coffee that is coming to us probably the following subscription that comes out to you guys. We will have a very detailed brewing method for you guys, as well as a in-depth write-up and video for you guys on how that double fermented coffee is tasting. And I have been looking for this coffee, or a coffee like this, for 6 months. Super excited. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I am stoked about what is coming. We are expanding, we are growing, so stay tuned on our Instagram and Facebook, and we will keep you guys updated with where we're headed, and we cannot do it without you. So thank you guys so much. Have a great day.